Okay, well, Julie's a hard act to follow, so I won't try and follow her act. But I'm very pleased to be chairing this session. We've got some really excellent speakers. We do, as I say, we've got a bit of a blended approach, so hopefully that's actually going to work technically. But in any case, we'll kick off a very interesting session, as I said, on a range of topics that are close to my heart. So I'm going to kick off with Charles. He's in the room. So Charles Brooke, Program Leader for Livestock, Enteric Methane at Spark Climate Solutions. He serves as Scientific Advisor to the International Union of Microbiological Sciences. He's a Steering Committee member for Nitrogen 2.0 and a Special Advisor to the Enteric Fermentation R&D Accelerator. Charles.
Perfect. Thank you, Wayne, and thank you very much to the organizers for having me out. It's been a truly tremendous past couple of days. I was able to fly into Auckland on Friday, make my way down to Wellington, and see a really great portion of this beautiful North Island. So I want to take a little bit of a step back. Earlier we talked about the IPCC targets that were framed, and now I'd like to take us in a little bit closer, specifically on enteric methane. And we'll see if we can get it to go. Here we are. Now these are kind of old data, but I think it does a very good job of communicating a very simple set of targets. And on the left-hand side, you have methane in teragrams per year. We can argue about whether or not those are precise. And on the right, on the x-axis, we have the years in decades to 2050. You have dashed lines on both of these, which represent the 24 and 47% methane reduction targets from the 2010 levels. And you have a variety of trend lines in each of these panels. The trend lines each represent a percentage of adoption of an inhibitor or a technology that's capable of reducing enteric methane by 60%. 60% is the target, or is at least the baseline that was used for this modeling. And on the left is the intensity of those emissions. That's per kilogram of product. And on the right is the current trajectory for our emissions intensity globally. So that's an improvement of emissions intensity about 1% per year. First thing I'd like to show is that between the left and the right, emissions intensity doesn't get us down into those two dashed lines, right? Those two dashed lines areas where we need to be. And the only one that gets into them is 100% adoption of something capable of 60% reduction. Obviously, we can get a little bit less than 100% adoption and still be within that line. But that was based on 2010 levels. The reality is we've had about a decade or more of largely inaction in adoption in some of these strategies. And so we're going to need even more effective strategies or even greater adoption globally. Now, this is not really surprising for anybody who's actually in the space. But what is very important to note here is that 100% of farmers are not intensive-based farmers. The majority of emissions and the majority of farmers are from pasture-based systems and extensive systems, very much similar to what is represented here in New Zealand. And so the technologies that need to be developed globally really echo the technologies that need to be applied here in New Zealand. And I think the innovation ecosystem that's been developed here is really a North Star for the world and what needs to happen and the technologies that need to be developed. What's encouraging is that we've seen a lot of activity in the space. We see a lot of companies come to life to try to address the enteric methane emissions problem. Now, and is anyone here surprised by the number of companies on the slide? Raise your hand just quickly. Anyone surprised? No one's surprised. The reality is this was just what fit on the slide nicely. There's a lot more, right? Now, what might surprise you is that less than 10% of these are actually pursuing pasture-based innovation. Now, generally, what you do is when you make a startup or you have a company, you want to say, I want to build something and I want to get to market as soon as possible. Now, the quickest way to get into market is to go into an intensive dairy system or a feedlot system. And then you say, once I figure that out, then I'll try to figure out my pasture-based systems. And what that does is it builds in about 5 years of R&D that you lose and before you actually start working on your pasture-based systems. And so it's been really wonderful working with the folks at AgriZero who really have that laser focus on innovation that can work in a pasture-based system. So there's different types of investment in the innovation ecosystem, though. It's not just about investing in companies. It's about investment in all the other things that can make these companies impactful. And the reality is that there's a lot of players on the field, but they lack coordination across the board. And some of you may recognize some of these quotes in here, but our lack of focus globally on pasture-based solutions has really started to put a dent in the overall view of these technologies. Just a couple of these won't ever be relevant to the grazing majority of the world's livestock, right? This is greenwashing. These are just, these are techno solutions, what have you. If we don't do a better job of communicating what's needed and also what the potential impact of these technologies are, they won't ever get to scale, right? It's not just about how we feel about it, it's about how investors feel about the technology, because that's going to continue to help drive those things forward. So I think there's opportunity to get, not just the companies on that slide, but many others, to come together to start to really think about how we communicate. Very similar to what we see for AgriZero's Catalyst Fund, but there's a lot of players on the field. And they could have a large voice if they were singing from the same song sheet. And we could really start to influence not just policy, but really start to show people what this industry is capable of. And so more recently, a group of about 25 or more organizations got together and helped formed GEMIA, which is the Global Enteric Methane Industry Association. This is, and whether or not we recognize it, it is an industry. There is a large number of organizations who are working towards a common goal of trying to develop this. And this is what industry associations do, is they help break down common barriers on a pre-competitive space. And then the last one I want to address is a different type of investment. And usually in the US, we say chicken and the egg. I'm sure you do here, but we saw the kiwi birds on our way down from Auckland, so I figured I'd pop this one in here. And it's how we sell investment in the space. And really, why should I develop something no one is buying? Or how do I communicate to my investors that I should build it? And then how do I buy something that doesn't exist? And actually, someone got a Nobel Prize for solving this question. In 2019, Michael Kremer from the University of Chicago got the Nobel Prize for the development originally for an advanced market commitment. So what is an advanced market commitment? It's really, it's a way to encourage the development of new products or services. You promise to buy or subsidize something if they are successfully developed. And you get to say, I want X. I want a product that costs X, that can be delivered in this situation, that is this effective. And if you make it, great, I'll buy it. If you don't, then I don't buy it. And we have I think there's an opportunity here for us to look at this and look at the enteric methane space and say, this has worked. We see it in carbon removal. We see it in shipping and steel. We've seen it in vaccine development. And when you talk about agriculture, people will say, well, I can't work in agriculture. Why not? And so we started to really look at, well, what could it work? What would be the most analogous? And the first was we looked at, a vaccine, right? This is what was used for COVID-19, this type of model. This was used for all kinds of different vaccines in the developing world to get the large companies to invest the time and effort into developing strategies because you were able to demonstrate a strong buy signal. And so what are the criteria for an advanced market commitment? Those who could develop a solution are blocked by uncertainty of whether there'll be a buyer. I'm sure this is maybe ringing a bell for folks. We can at least partly describe the end product of what this problem is we want to solve. Or even after the product gets invented, further incentive is needed to bridge the gap to a long-term market. And some of these things, like this, would be very applicable to things that are really sensitive to time. And when you think about time and a really novel application of the advanced market commitment, it could be for the use of genetics specifically. You need a strong buyer signal to develop the index, but every year we don't make those choices is a year we lose. We can't wait until the buyer signal is there naturally for us to start making these decisions and building those emissions reductions through genetics. So with that, those are a couple of the ideas in the innovation, investment for innovation. I'm happy to sit down and step off my soapbox just briefly. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that, Charles. Pleasure to have you down here for the conference. Moving on now to Andy Jarvis. So Andy's going to be speaking online, and there he is. That's excellent. So Andy is the Director of Future of Food for the Bezos Earth Fund. He's worked for over 20 years in research for development and to support delivery of food security and environmental sustainability in food systems. So Andy, over to you.
Thanks a lot. And I'm sorry I can't be there in person. I was expecting Charles to be looking terrible with awful jet lag, but it seems like the beauty of the North Island has helped him overcome it. So anyway, I'm avoiding that jet lag, but I would love to visit the North Island and see well, all of New Zealand. It's on my bucket list, but there'll be another time. So first of all, well, thanks for having me here. I guess I'll backtrack a little and look at the very, very big picture, right? Let's just run through some of the numbers, right, of agricultural finance. So we're talking about the kind of investment in R&D here. You have a food system, depending on how you kind of define it and things, it's $13 to $16 trillion, right? It's enormous, right? Livestock, we've been talking, and I kind of tend to focus quite a lot on livestock, particularly as the source of methane, one of the primary kind of agricultural sources of greenhouse gas emissions. So livestock is about 2 to 3 trillion of that 13 to 16 trillion business, right? We talk a lot about the subsidies that are going. So, of that 13 to 16 trillion, well, 600 to 800 billion of that, and this is US dollars, is coming from governments. So it's public programs that are providing subsidies one way or another, right? And I guess depending on, how you define this, but, there are studies out there showing that 60–80% of those subsidies are for environmentally harmful activities, right? So, a lot of those emissions are getting actually driven or supported one way or another by public subsidies as well, right? Now, if you look at, big numbers, 13, 16 trillion, going in, livestock 2 to 3 trillion. If you look at agricultural R&D in that, agricultural R&D, just as a percentage of the agricultural kind of GDP around the world, is, in the best of the best countries, which are few and far between, it maybe comes close to hitting 1%. In the vast majority, it's actually below 0.5%, closer to 0.2%, right? It's tiny. It's an industry that is not invested adequately, right? And you compare that with many other sectors, and it really is way below where it should be, and OECD, recommend 2–3% on that. So, the R&D going in is very small. Now, we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions, climate finance, just some numbers on the climate finance, right? So over the years 2021 to 2023, climate finance is $1.3 trillion. The food system has received about 2.5% of that, right? So again, it's a tiny percentage of the climate finance is flowing into the food system. And I'm not even talking about agricultural R&D or in any way. This is just into food. Of the public finance, the climate finance coming from the public, it's just 1.5%, right? So the case is not being made for investment on a climate perspective into agriculture and food, right? So that's the kind of those are the big numbers. That's our large kind of the architecture of money, the finance in agriculture and food. Doesn't look so great, right? So then let's think about the problem, right? And this is where, these numbers, it's 2.5%, for example, of climate finance. Well, it's a third of global emissions, right? It's over 10 times more, in terms of footprint versus the amount of climate finance that flows in, right? That's too low. I mean, we look at the food system, agriculture, it's the primary driver of deforestation. Cattle is the primary use of that land use. It's 4 or 5 million hectares every year being lost, cattle being the primary driver. And we have a land footprint already where 2/3 of ice-free land is under food or agriculture. 80% of that is for livestock, animal source foods, either be it direct grazing or be it feed for animals, right? So enormous footprints. And methane, which is essentially an enormous opportunity for fast climate action, well, 60% of it or more is coming from livestock. So you have this kind of dichotomy. You have this kind of like enormous numbers in terms of the size of agriculture and the food system, and an enormous footprint of in terms of emissions, but the actual money that is going into agricultural research and R&D is way below, like orders of magnitude below where it really should be if you're just going to follow those numbers, right? So that's kind of where we are. So that's the kind of glass half empty look at things, right? I mean, so we have this extreme underinvestment versus those other mitigation areas. And if you look at oil and gas, you look at transport, you look at other areas of high sources of emission, they have vastly increased percentages of money going into R&D, right? So we're underinvesting in agriculture and food, right? And this, that's at a very macro level, very kind of general. But I mean, you see it when you dig into topics, and one of the topics that we dug into, and there was lots of Kiwis in this group, probably in the audience there, that have been involved in this one way or another, is the search for a vaccine, right? So work around the vaccine. AgriZero have been involved, Ag Research, number of, there's been, New Zealand has really been leading the way on this. But the truth is, when you go in there, you sit in the room, okay, and we're talking about the source of 15%, 10, 15, 12, whatever you believe, but 10, 15% of global emissions. And you talk to the 10 experts, the 10 people that actually know anything about producing a vaccine for this thing. And, they're all like fighting for scraps of money. I mean, and it's very fragmented. There's no real kind of oomph behind it, right? Like there is in other sectors, right? And I think, so, that is really the problem that we have, is that this has just been so underinvested. You have a very disorganized sector, kind of, collaborations across, global cooperation. You have, as Charles just showed, you've got, a load of startups, the vast majority you've probably never heard of. It's a very small, fragmented space. And everyone fighting over scraps. But, if you look at the way the world is going, if you look at the kind of trends on this, right? I mean, we have this thing called the Systems Change Lab at the Bezos Earth Fund, and we track 42 systems changes transformations that need to happen over the next few decades. 42 of them. And so, it's like adoption of, electric vehicles, or it's, the kind of race towards, renewable energy and so on. We track those 42 and we look which ones are on track, which ones are ahead, which ones are going in the wrong direction, and which ones are kind of need to really ramp up, the speed of change. Unfortunately, when you get to food and ag, there are, I think, 6 indicators. All of them are basically either wildly off track or going in the wrong direction, right? So, whereas if you look in places like transport and you look in energy, there is traction and things are moving. You're seeing curves change. You even have, in renewables and solar, basically penetration has gone beyond our wildest dreams in terms of speed, right, of change. So, I think, in all these trends, what you're going to have is the most stubborn emissions are going to come from food. In most other sectors, you're on a trajectory right now where we are seeing reductions. In food, it's going in the wrong direction. And so, I think, this is going to become more and more an area of focus. It's been politically kind of somewhat taboo to talk about mitigation in the ag sector, because of kind of very strong kind of kind of farmers groups rejecting kind of the trade-off with food security, for example. Number of reasons. It's different on every continent in every country, but it really hasn't been brought into the focus, right? And in COPs, in UNFCCC meetings, it was always kind of, you couldn't, don't mention the F word. Food is not to be mentioned, right? That's too difficult and politically unappetizing. So, and I think that's changing as well. So in the last, in Dubai, for example, in COP28, you had an enormous shift in the political spectrum around addressing food in climate conversation. So I think the focus is going to come just more and more, right? So what is the approach to this? And I think, I'll speak more from my own personal kind of experience on this, seeing I've been now 2 and a bit years working with the Bezos Earth Fund, looking at all of these range of solutions to address particularly enteric fermentation, but emissions from livestock particularly. And along the lines of what Charles has shown, we need 1,000 flowers to bloom really on this. This is requiring a multitude of solutions. And you just need to do the maths. I mean, first of all, you have massive diversity of systems, so a system, a milking system in New Zealand is completely different to, dairy operation in Africa. An extensively grazed pasture kind of system in Brazil is completely different to, a feedlot finished system in the US. And so you have this enormous diversity of systems, and we need solutions for all of those. And just as Charles said, grazing has been receiving, very little attention. That's the kind of, there is so much on feed additives, but you need feedlots for those feed additives really to, or you need concentration of animals for those to really work. Grazing, these extensively grazed systems, which is actually where the most inefficient systems are from an emissions perspective, very few solutions out there coming, right? So we need to be looking at all of these different systems. And when you do the maths, if each one of these interventions or technologies that we develop, be it a vaccine, we're looking at this kind of magic number of 20-30% reduction. If we can achieve that with a technology, then we're happy. But if you get a 20% reduction with a certain technology, you're only going to get 10, 20, maybe 30% adoption if you're lucky, certainly in the first few years. You start doing and then you only apply that to the systems where it counts. These numbers, these percentage reductions get smaller and smaller and smaller. So we really do need 1,000 flowers to bloom. We need to be investing in diversity and a diverse set of approaches. And also, because we are so far behind, I believe, from an R&D perspective on this, we need to be taking risks and trying stuff that won't work, right? We need to be eliminating some of the, we need to be trying things out and failing fast and moving on to the next one. So, I think that's the approach we need, and then the final thing is just to say, I think it's great, Charles mentioned these, what's it called? Buying markets, the kind of market makers and so on, advanced market commitments. Sorry, but I think just to complement that, that's very much important. That's needed. But I think also governments can do an awful lot on this. And I'll use this example. Right now, I guess we're kind of building the field of dreams, right? If we have these technologies, the market will come. And I do feel like the market will come towards us for the reasons I've explained just now. But at the same time, there is stuff you can do, not just with advanced market commitments, but also by governments leading. And I'll use the example of Denmark. Denmark has, been, the country that's put in place this meat tax on individual animals as a tax for farmers. But all of that is can be reduced by adoption of certain technologies, and that's sending an enormously important market signal for companies, for researchers, and so on to start working on these technologies, these next generation technologies. And if countries like Denmark and many more and bigger ones hopefully send that kind of a market signal, I think we'll be in a much better space on the agricultural R&D side for this. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks a lot, and look forward to the discussion right now in the panel.
Thanks very much, Andy. Thanks for joining us, and look forward to you answering some of the questions later. Some have come through for you specifically. We'll now move on to introduce Tom Sturgess. So Tom is coming to us online as well. Tom is always an entertaining speaker, so there he is. Tom chairs the investment committee for Regen VC. He also chairs Methane Mitigation Ventures. He is a majority shareholder in Headwaters, a sheep breeding, genetic production, marketing and sales collaboration with 70 farms. He owns Lone Star Farms Limited, which produces 80,000 lambs and 2,000 calves a year.
Wayne, that's enough. Let's go, man.
And has a wide interest in a wide range of competing methane mitigating technologies. So that was the end anyway, Tom. Over to you.
Hey, Charles, it's great to see you, man. The guy with his hands up there with that black jacket, he's a hero. He's a worldwide hero, everybody. This guy is leaving nothing on the playing field. He's got my total respect. I'm going to change this up just a little bit from the bit I've heard of this. So I am not affiliated or associated with any governmental entity, no publicly held corporation. I have no role in academia. I'm not a scientist. I'm just an impatient old fart. All right? And maybe I'm a pragmatist. So we started in this area about 5 years ago, and we experienced frustration upon frustration. Currently, we are directly invested in 6 technologies that involve either direct methane mitigation from enteric fermentation or the measurement thereof. And, you know, I'm a little more optimistic on the technology side. My comments are only meant to be directed towards New Zealand, all right? And they're primarily directed toward the farmer. And I haven't heard any farmers talk yet. I've been involved in New Zealand farming for 26 years now. And in my experience, there's only one really effective way to get a New Zealand farmer to do something different. And that's to do it alongside them and make more money than them doing it and drive up the driveway in a shiny new ute. All right? That'll work. That's how we got the sheep program that we're talking about here working. The last load of sheep meat that just got delivered to Saudi Arabia commanded a 55% premium over commodity lamb. The dyeing industry, which went from 70 million to 38 million to 23 million, right? And whose productivity has increased at a high performer level ahead of the 3% a year that General Electric used to have as a nominal requirement. It's not necessarily a sunset industry. All of the numbers we hear are gigantic aggregates. They're gigantic aggregates. When Dr. Carr used his 8% to 18% range for dairy cows for efficiency, I go here. One of the things we've been really challenged on is finding ways to measure the efficacy of things that we do. After a less than delightful experience about 4 years ago that cost me damn near $250,000 in 90 days to get a response out of a well-known New Zealand research institute, we tried to figure out a better way to do it ourselves. We today, and Adrian, tug your nose when I say too much, mate. Today, we have 20 robotic rumens that operate on a 3-week interval with at a 3-week measurement period with a high 90s R squared to in vivo that measure the creation of methane, hydrogen, carbon, oxygen, the 6 volatile fatty acids, and transmit that information real time. There might be a 48-hour delay there for some synthesis of a couple of calculations. All right? This technology is being used today by a major international seed company to develop genetic strains that will optimize their objective function as more profit. One of the objective functions, liably, I'm certain, is the reduction of methane without giving up efficacy as a forage. Another company we're involved in has in excess of 120 days, in excess of 70% enteric fermentation reduction in ruminants with a one-time application. Wayne, you know who I'm speaking to, and I don't think I've overspoken the case there. I've actually understated it a bit. Look at the grin right there. You guys see that knowing grin right there? Okay? The technology's coming. It's coming. It's coming. And what we're going to get is a family of solutions, in my personal opinion, which are going to include active methane mitigation within the animal. It's going to include the improvement in animal genetics very quickly. It's going to be a step function. We're going to get a really, really quick pickup because we're going to weed out the underperformers. Guess what? If they don't lamb at 120%, they're out of the flock. Guess what? If they belch X amount of CH4, they're out of the event, right? That's going to happen real quickly. Then we'll start probably a 1%, 1.5% per annum genetic gain with real-time monitoring with selective breeding. We'll start seeing forage genetics. We're going to start to see one I don't hear anybody talk about, husbandry. Poor Adrian's heard this stuff so many times, bless his heart. Hey, I got an idea. Let's not keep a feeder steer around for 3 years, huh? Let's get them to wait in 16 months or 18 months, cut their head off, convert them into meat, and get them the hell out of the show. That will not play in the United States of America. Anybody want to make a guess what the average size of the cattle herd, the average cattle herd in the United States with 95 million head of cattle, the average beef cattle herd in the land of the cowboys? You want to know how big it is? 47 cows. 47 cows. I think Rod Carr said it earlier. It's a cultural statement. They are not agribusiness people. They are voters. I contrast that to New Zealand. Very, very different situation. Very different situation. Here we have a country whose primary greenhouse gas emission in the first year, in the first 12 months that it comes out, this is not GWP 100, GWP 20, or GWP star. Adrian, this is your cue. This is GWP 1. This slide, I can't see the slide, so tell me when it shows up. This slide was computed by a person who ran the department inside the World Bank for financial analysis and program analysis. He has a doctorate from Stanford University. He's a professor at Johns Hopkins. Adrian, does it show up yet?
Yes, it does.
Okay. What this shows is the effect of 1 ton of methane in the first 12 months. That ratio is not the 83 you hear about. It's not the 24. It's 150. This is serious stuff. All right? You can take it down now. You can take it down. Now, in New Zealand, I can take my activity, which creates roundabout, me and a bunch of other farmers, $4 billion to $8 billion of hard currency with this, which New Zealand is desperate for, right? I can make 1% or 2% as a farmer. I can go plant it in pine trees for the benefit of the rest of the country and make myself 12% to 15% IRR. I don't know what that does to the hard currency piece, but as we come up with these solutions, we cannot put it on the back of the farmer, the sheep and beef farmer. And I'm telling you why. It's not because anything to do with principles. It has to do with the fact the suckers are broke. They simply can't do it. We're going to get suicides. We're going to get higher space land abandonment. They walked off the runs in 1947. All right? We're going to get that. There's a better way. There's a better way to find a way to mitigate methane through the variety of activities I talked about earlier. Remember, we're on a learning curve here. What we can do, what we're talking about now, 5 years from now, we will laugh at ourselves. We'll be so far down the path. As people do the right behavior, they need to get a reward. And it needs to be in the rest of New Zealand's selfish best interest to keep that hard currency coming, to let the farmer get in for a piece of that pie. It's just pragmatic. You want the 11 billion or whatever it is, you want another 25 billion or whatever it is from dairy, you got to let it have some of the pie. That's just my own opinion. You can, shut me off later on. We have multi-source mitigation coming in. We have a learning curve coming on. We have I heard the word hope. We don't have to give hope in specious things, but we need to start talking to farmers with numbers and ranges and not generalities. We need to can the platitudes. We can understand uncertainty. Uncertainty is very fine, right? New Zealanders have it all the time. The All Blacks going to win? Yes. What's this point spread going to be? That's the uncertainty. We can live with that. We can live with that. This issue about the about insetting and offsetting, I'm going to retire from the debate on this, but with one principle I believe we need to hold dear. Without the intervention of the Crown, the farmer is going to get stuffed on this one. The debit is going to come all the way from the gigantic multinational offshore New Zealand. That debit is going to roll through the supply chain and pick up speed and pick up speed and pick up speed. And all the intermediary organizations are going to get their fair lick of it. And the deductions are going to come, and the farmer is going to get left with a poo sandwich. It's not fair. It's not right. That doesn't mean the farmer needs to get all the economic benefit for him, but cut him in. If I have to pick a number just as a number, which nobody else can do, because you guys all got people you're accountable to, and I don't, I would pick, and this is after talking to some very, very talented dairy farmers. I know this number works inside the sheep piece side. And then Wayne, cut me off. I can't see the clock, Nate. I'll make this the last hit and then I'll cut. About $50. About $50 net to the dairy cow farmer. Now, real quick, there are technologies out there being worked on right now that have direct manufacturing costs. This is not priced to the farmer. This is direct manufacturing costs in the range of $25 to $40 a year per animal. And those numbers are coming down. Those are very different than other numbers you're going to hear because they all got prices in it. Thank you very much for your tolerance.
Thanks very much, Tom. That was great, and look forward to you being around for the questions later as well.
I'll leave you for you.
Okay, so we're moving on to our last speaker now. So Adrian, who's in the room here. Adrian is responsible for setting and executing Methane Mitigation Ventures, commercialisation pathway. Experienced in commercialisation, his mission in this role is to find the intersection between technology and the market at pace. Adrian.
Thanks, Wayne, and kia ora, tēnā koutou katoa. I'm just appreciative of the opportunity, and I'm also highly conscious that I'm the last man standing between you and food, so I'll try and keep this brief. I'm going to talk about how, in our view, the venture capital goalposts have moved in the last sort of 12 to 18 months in terms of backing or funding methane mitigating technologies. Just a little bit of context, we're both a family office with investments in decarbonisation technologies globally, both through Tom's family office, which I oversee on this side of things, plus Tom and I sit on the investment committee of a US-EU climate tech fund that does similar work in the decarb space. So before providing thoughts on how those goalposts are moving in terms of venture capital finding a home in methane mitigating technologies, I'd just like to throw up a slide just for a minute that provides a little bit of background context in terms of how we sometimes think about the generations of methane inhibiting solutions. Yeah, that's a bit better. So in terms of how we think about it, we've sort of categorised it internally just in terms of generations 1 through to 4. And in terms of investment funds, of capital going into those different generations of products, we see, like, for example, today, the vast majority is going into the likes of genetics and vaccines. This isn't reflective of what has gone on. This is what we're seeing and hearing is going in today in terms of ratios. We also sort of overlay the impact of each of these platforms in terms of the efficacy that you might expect from at the animal level. And then we also look at the breadth of application. So the breadth of application, for example, for boluses, we've got medium there. I mean, that's because when we think of breadth of application, it's on all ruminants globally. So clearly, if you've got farm systems where the landowner only owns one or two cows, you're going to have a different penetration. So yeah, thanks for the slide. So moving on to how the goalposts have moved. A lot's changed in the last 12 to 18 months. 12 to 18 months ago, if a product owner could show us that they had moderate to high product efficacy in vivo and could also provide us with a believable regulatory pathway to market, then all other things being equal, there was a fair chance that that company would get funding. Not today. The goalposts have moved. It's a very, very different reality today in just 12 months. And then when I talk about realities, I think that markets, it's useful to remember that markets lead reality. So what do I mean by that? So if you think of the stock market, it's always thinking 6, 12, 18 months out. If you think of Reserve Bank actions, similar. If you think of venture capital going into methane mitigating technologies, it's also thinking past the current day reality. So if I took bromoform as an example, 12 months ago, that was a major, major concern through the eyes of a VC company. It's still a major concern. I mean, it's still going to take, the reality is that it's still going to take 2 to 4 years in countries like EU, or jurisdictions like the EU and the US. But in terms of the lens of the venture capitalist, they've basically concluded, in our view, that this is going to get sorted. And we've seen some evidence of some of the movements towards getting that sorted in terms of the initiatives, in terms of codex, which are to be commended. So today the focus has very much moved on to what are the underlying economic drivers that will power your underlying solution. So those other things, regulatory pathway to market, product efficacy, remain important, but it's moved on to a couple of other things that we think are taking even more prominence. One is productivity, the impact on productivity as a result of your methane mitigating application. And the second one is the monetisation of carbon. And we don't view these two as mutually exclusive. They can actually be very importantly linked. So, as you've heard from Tom, we're not just venture capitalists, we're also farmers. We understand productivity and we measure it like most farmers. And in the context of a methane mitigant being applied to an animal, there's a cost. The cost of that is about a 4% lift in productivity. That's the cost, that's the lift in productivity that a farmer would need to achieve in order to pay for both the cost of the product and the implementation of that product that they've just purchased. And that'll vary. It could be 3%, it could be 4 to 4.2%. The point is, and that's subject to the cost of the mitigant, the efficacy of the mitigant, the duration of the mitigant. But the point is, there's a significant productivity lift required if one is not to rely on the monetisation of the methane credit, which is still a relatively nascent industry. Farm methane units is what we call them within MMV. So the monetisation of carbon credit is the other key question that we will drill down in terms of a technology platform provider seeking a capital for their company. And so it's all about how does the company de-risk its value proposition to the farmer. And we get all sorts of answers. One answer is that, well, hey, we'll bring in the corporates to uptake the offtake. Well, what does that mean? Well, that actually means insetting. So, and we're big fans on insetting, not at the exclusion of other monetisation models that should be available to the government, to the farmer, and to ensure marketplace efficiency, price discovery, but massive fan of it nonetheless. The urgency of the problem is reflected by the CPG companies of this world, like the Nestle's and the Danones. They're demanding Scope 3 reductions. So those signals, as Rod quite rightly pointed out, those signals are coming through from the market. And what's driving the market is both the changes in the regulatory framework, which we're seeing in the EU, and also consumer demand. So it's a market access problem, and the product owners who we talk to need to demonstrate a solution to venture capital providers as part of their go-to-market strategy. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Adrian. And I'd also like to add my acknowledgement to MPI for the recent initiative at Codex, which was a really good piece of work and a long way to go, but great to get it started. So we have got a lot of questions. I had a few pre-prepared ones, but we'll forget about those because we've got loads of them on the app here. And I'll just ask them to everybody on the panel rather than the specifics that people have asked. So the first one, with less than 10% of companies looking at pastoral solutions, how long will it take, how soon will overseas farmers be clearly more GHG efficient than New Zealand? We'll start with you, Charles, because you are amongst those overseas farmers in California.
Sure. Repeat the last part of that question for me, would you please?
How soon will overseas farmers be clearly more GHG efficient than New Zealand?
Well, I guess it's going to depend on which production systems you're looking in, right? Especially for beef systems, and again, how you measure it. But like in the US, with finishing feedlot systems and a measurement and efficiency, we do a pretty good job. Obviously, there's a large section out there that's not able to be accessed as far as emissions are concerned, but we continue to see this move towards intensification, and that intensification does have benefits in efficiency, in emissions intensity, but at the cost of a lot more. And so, I'm from California. Our California dairies are very intensively based structures, and we don't have access to the rainfall like you might have in New Zealand, or like what you might see in Scotland or in Ireland. And so we, really reliant on those intensive systems and the trucking of grain. But those high energy dense materials also improve the efficiencies of those production systems. Without it, I think the European nexus and the US, I think we're still making a lot of progress. We're still heads down, focused on production, right? I don't think we've made the strong shift in focusing on greenhouse gas emissions as much as a lot of the rest of the world, at least speaking for the U.S. But that we are seeing that a lot change quite a bit from pressure from supply chain. So it's hard for me to give a timeline for that. It depends on what the value chain companies want, and that's how we're going to respond.
Yeah, thanks, Charles. Has anybody else on the panel got anything they would like to say?
I'll chuck one in. There are large-scale 30,000 head of cattle in Australia kicking off on a mitigant, and it's in a feedlot kind of situation. That's imminent. Adrian, isn't it? You know what I'm talking about? That's the next month or two.
Yes.
So that's, interestingly enough, is a New Zealand technology developed in New Zealand, product created in New Zealand, but it can't be used in New Zealand for regulatory reasons. So it's going off to Australia. It's way too early to call winners on this. Way, way, way too early. New Zealand's still way in the hunt, for sure.
Yeah, I'd just back that up. I think that, you can look at this from a couple of different angles. There's the product angle, and I think New Zealand is a bit of a hotbed in terms of some of the methane mitigating technology approaches and the R&D pipeline, which you, Wayne, are quite well across. But then there's the regulatory framework and the emissions trading framework. And I think that those are probably the two areas that will determine how fast New Zealand keeps pace or perhaps has the opportunity to overtake what's happening overseas. So I think it's less on the product side and more on the regulatory pathway to market and emissions monetisation side.
So I just wanted to add one more when I think about catching up. So obviously the U.S. did release a non-enforcement discretion for 3NOP, for Bovaer, which is regulatory speak for we won't treat it like a drug. And we do have quite a bit of incentives coming down the pipe in 2024 in the U.S. And most of those are going to be centered in California, but it'll be the adoption of 3NOP on about 500,000 animals. And for the dairy herd, that's a considerable amount. In the U.S., we have about 9.7 million dairy head, and so for most of that, for 500,000 of those to be fed 3NOP over the course of 2-3 years is going to be a significant project and significant adoption for at least the dairy herd in the U.S.
Thanks. Andy, I've got one for you, targeted at you now. We'll start with you and then others can chip in. Some have covered this earlier. Andy, who is going to pay for mitigation in agriculture? Because the answer normally ends at farmers and profitability is not high enough to cope with this.
I fully agree. The problem is that always the buck gets kind of passed down the chain all the way, back to the farmer. Basically, that's history's proven that correct on so many different things, and it's. I don't think it certainly isn't in principle how this should work. There is always that danger. I just think the market is going to come to this, right? The opportunity is, as climate bites, as the climate crisis gets worse, the demand for real solutions is just going to go up and up. The governments are going to become more and more serious about this, and and I can see things like when the technology in livestock and food system generally get better and the risks reduce, climate finance will start flowing as well for this. So I do think things will flow. There'll be new sources to pay for this, and I think and I hope that it will be a combination of some on the farmer, that could be just in the Denmark case, for example, where if you adopt certain technologies, you get subsidies, or you can realign those 600 to 800 billion dollars of subsidies, agricultural subsidies around the world to be supporting the farmers that are actually adopting these kinds of things. So there's a lot can be done. I think you need that share of the cost across the value chain, right? The other thing is Scope 3 emissions on companies. They're getting, most of the big multinationals are getting more and more serious about that as well. And when they start looking at that, they're going to see that it implies costs. If they want to reduce their Scope 3 emissions, they need to be supporting farmers with some of the technologies that will achieve that. So I think it needs to be a collective responsibility rather than, kind of saying, one particular actor pays. It's government, it's private sector in the middle, and it's farmers on the ground.
Thanks, Andy. Other comments? Who's going to pay?
Yeah, look, I'll make one other comment on that. I agree with what Andy just said, My concern with insetting, relying totally on insetting, of which we are big advocates, is that insetting by definition means that there's still very limited incentive, if any, for the downstream players below the farmer, whether it be processors or CPGs, to actually provide the farmer with any more than the bare minimum to keep the farmer laying the golden goose or golden egg. In other words, life support. So I don't think a pure inset-only model will deliver the true price discovery that's required for the farmer to have the ability to share in those gains. So I think that there needs to probably be a hybrid model, and that's a conversation for another day.
Thanks, Adrian. The thing that worries me about the shifting of subsidies is that New Zealand doesn't have any subsidies, so we don't have any to shift. But anyway, also a conversation for another day. We've got time for one more question, and this is one I'm particularly interested in, so I'm going to ask, and it's also jumped up a bit. If farmers monetise methane reductions and sell these outside of their value chain, what risk is this to food and fibre exporters who can't double count the reductions? So if farmers count the reductions, what's the risk to exporters who then can't count them again? And I'll just open that to everybody for our last question.
The risk is that the exporter who wants it can raise the ante and buy it for his exclusive use from the farmer.
Yeah, it's going to depend on what you're trying to do with this with the product. And I mean, to double count monetization, right? That's what everyone's concerned about, right? And so I do think there's interesting models, right? There's the insetting model, but then there's just purchase price agreements, right? How much am I willing to pay for a product at X amount of intensity or X amount of reductions associated with that? And so that way a farmer is able to monetize that directly, and a end product buyer is able to account for that and able to advertise that because they've paid for it, right? So that's where we start to have more of the insetting conversation. It starts to drift back towards those individual agreements. But where the value lies is the real question. How expensive these products are, where can we get them paid for, is generally where the value in the supply chain is, and that's generally not the farmer. And so, how do we split that up in a reasonable means between all the players, and how do we get reasonable credit across for that?
Yeah, look, also it gets back to a point I was making a few minutes ago, in that if you can demonstrate either a lift, even some lift in productivity from some of that freed up energy that's not otherwise going into methanogenesis, so it could be productivity, or it could be a health claim like an omega-3 that the market cares enough to open their wallet for, such as EnviroBeef, which Charles, you can talk to, I know. So then you emphasise the do or die on the monetisation of an associated carbon credit. So if you've got a productivity lift, the amount that the carbon credit has to contribute to the cost of the intervention goes down. And so that's I think it's you need to look at both.
It also makes it much more attractive to the farmer, obviously, to take up the new technology if they get a productivity gain. So thanks very much. I said it would be an excellent set of panellists, and it certainly has been. Hopefully you can join me in thanking them for their time on the session.